Well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's preview session for our upcoming Learn with the Nerds session with Mitchell Pearson, who's joined us here today. Mitchell is going to be presenting on a new feature, still in beta within Power BI, called visual calculations. And so we want to get you a little familiar with what to expect from that session next week. It's going to be on April 11th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So for our Eastern time folks, that's when you can prepare and you can adjust your time accordingly. But we have Mitchell here with us today. Many of you are already very familiar with Mitchell and his expertise on Power BI, DAX, Azure, even now Fabric. And so, Mitchell, before we get started with some questions to help prepare people for this session, why don't you take a moment for those maybe the few that maybe don't know you already, take a moment and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here. My name is Mitchell Pearson. I've been with Pragmatic Works for a long, long time. I've been here almost 12 years, and I've done consulting for a long, long time. And then we obviously do pretty much nothing but training. Now that's the primary focus of our company. So that's what I do. But like Devin said, I've been doing Power BI, DAX, Azure for a long time. And now we have a really new, exciting technology that Microsoft has released as part of Power BI that we can really take advantage of. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week.
Yeah, well, that takes us a good transition into our first question, which, Mitchell, is what are you going to be covering? So tell us about the session.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about visual calculations in DAX. And what we want to learn in the session, or what we want to get from it, is how can we leverage this new technology? How can it come alongside what we already know, what we already use, and really make our job easier in some areas? It's not going to fix everything or make everything easier. It's not going to be, completely replacing DAX, not yet. But how can we leverage that technology? How can we make things a little bit easier with visual calculations? And what we want to do is really dive into it and understand all the little nuances that exist, because it is something that's new. So we want to make sure that we understand how to best leverage that technology.
No, that's great. Kind of side question here. When did this feature get released? As far I think it's still in beta, right, or still in preview. But when was it released?
It's still in preview. I believe it came out with the February 2024 version of Power BI Desktop. So in order to follow along, you actually need February 2024 or later, because it's a very new feature inside of Power BI.
Great. So maybe take us a little bit more in depth into the session itself. What are some of the things that those that will be attending learn? You mentioned the high level. We're going to be covering visual calculations, but take us a step further. What are they going to be learning in the session?
Yeah, so we're going to be taking a look at what are visual calculations, why do we have them, especially since we already have quick measures. We already have a couple of other options that exist there, and then we have DAX itself. So where does visual calculations really fit into this puzzle, and where does it fit in our toolbox, right? Because it's a new tool that we're going to be able to leverage. And what I want to cover in this session is what we can do with visual calculations, some of the stuff that's made easier with visual calculations, but I also want to explore some of the limitations, because there are going to be some limitations. It's a preview feature. It's new. Microsoft is continually going to be updating it and making new changes and adding new features. So as it sits today, it's really great at certain things, but there's some other things we'd love to see in the tool. And so I want to go through that. Here's how I would have done it in DAX. Here's how we now can do this very quickly and efficiently in visual calculations without having to know quite as much DAX as maybe we would have needed to know before. And yeah, that's really most of what we're going to be covering in that session.
Well, I think you've alluded to it a couple times, but the next question I have for you is, do visual calculations eliminate the need to learn and understand DAX? So talk a little bit more about that, if you don't mind.
So yeah, people would love for that to be the case, right? People everywhere would love for DAX to be eliminated with visual calculations, and that's just not the case. Visual calculations are absolutely not replacing DAX. It's not. There's just some things you just can't do in there, and there's some things that, although I'm sure Microsoft could do anything they put their minds to, I don't know that they'll go that deep. I don't know that they'll try to replace everything that they can with visual calculations. I think it's an awesome tool that really solves a lot of the intermediary common problems that we have with DAX, but you're still going to need DAX to solve quite a few analytical challenges inside of Power BI for sure.
Yeah, for many people, including myself, DAX is probably one of the more difficult parts to learn with Power BI. There's that kind of 80-20 rule. You can learn 20% of the things that you need with Power BI, and you can get 80% of the
100%.
done, right? And then there's some of those things with DAX that are part of that extra learning that you have to do, of course. So again, along that theme of DAX and visual calculations and how they correlate with each other, are a lot of the same functions that you have with DAX also available with visual calculations, or is it just a different way of thinking? Can you talk us through that a little bit?
So I'm glad you asked. That's definitely something that we'll cover in the session as well, because you could definitely get into visual calculations and start to think that you don't have a lot of those other functions in DAX available to you to build conditional logic or to build out that expression, whatever it is that you're building inside of the visual calc. So the answer to that is most of the functions that are available in the DAX language, not all, but most of the functions available in the DAX language are still available to us right there inside of the visual calculation editor, or that little section where we do it. So yes, a lot of those are going to be available to us.
Okay, very cool. So I think this is definitely something you're going to dive into deeper, but maybe you can give us a little peek at how you would answer this question, which is, when would you choose to use visual calculations versus DAX? What's the deciding factor there?
That's still a tough one for me. That's going to be a big part of the session, right? Because you can easily solve some problems with visual calculations. But if I then go back into that visual calculation and I remove certain things, if I remove certain attributes that I'm slicing that data by, the calculation entirely changes based on now what attributes are in that visualization, right? So a lot of choosing, if you're going to write DAX and be very explicit with what the calculation is doing, or if you're going to build a visual calculation on top of what's in the visual, a lot of that decision-making process comes down to really understanding your end users, how much they're going to be changing and modifying the existing reports if they have that capability, and understanding future requirements from those business requirements or business users as well. So I think that, in certain situations, if I just need to get a quick moving average or something like that, and I can do it in visual calculations very quickly without any kind of complex DAX, that's definitely the way I'm probably going to go. But there's always going to be a caveat. Hey, if you remove this, the value changes and what is represented in the report changes. So I don't think it's going to be a very clear decision one way or the other that people can make. It's something that we have to talk through, just like you would when you're choosing various different types of visualizations within Power BI.
Do you think, is there, this is not, so I'm sorry, I'm throwing you this one unplanned here, but is there any kind of performance difference between things you would do in DAX? I'm assuming the answer is probably yes, but a lot of that's probably still to be discovered, I'm assuming, because it's such a new feature. But have you seen anything yourself around performance of DAX versus visual calculations?
I have not. What I would say is that if you're working with very small data sets, what I've seen is that when you go in and look at the performance, visual calcs seem to perform a little bit worse, actually. And I think because it's a separate operation that happens after the calculation has been performed, it's then represented in the visual, and then the visual calc is, of course, working over those aggregated totals. But you don't feel the difference. You can see that it's milliseconds difference consistently. You don't feel it. Where we've been told, and I just haven't worked with a data set big enough to really realize this, this from visual calculations. But what we've been told by Microsoft, and it makes sense, is that once we get into bigger data sets and you're performing very large calculations, you're taking that work out of the storage engine, out of the VertiPack engine, and you're just doing your base aggregation. And then once everything's already aggregated, we can just perform the calculation on those few rows in the visual. So performance should be significantly better, or at least visibly better, when we get into working with very large data sets. But what I've observed personally with smaller data sets is usually, and this is not what you observe in the report, but if you're looking at the actual millisecond difference, visual calculations are a tiny bit different.
Okay, very cool. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the logistics of the session. If someone wanted to follow along, they wanted to attend next week, obviously this is worth mentioning, and I'm sure you'll mention it during the session. It will be recorded. We always record those sessions. You can go back and watch them. But if someone wanted to follow along, whether it be live or even at a later point, what do they need to participate in the session?
Yeah, so we already mentioned part of it, right? February 2024, the version of February 2024. We also need to make sure that you turn on the preview feature, because it is a preview feature in Power BI. So if you've been working with Power BI almost every month, there's been one, over the years, there's been a month or two that's missed, but pretty much every month, the Power BI team releases new features that we can take advantage of. But to turn them on, you got to go into the preview features, right? So we'll have to go into the preview features, enable that capability there. And then when we do the event, we'll have a zip file that the attendees can download that will contain a completed and a start file for the Power BI file. Obviously, what I would caution attendees on during the live event is to be careful following along, because we want to make sure we get everything into that 1.5 hour session. So there will be points where I'll go a little bit faster, as if not expecting people to follow along. But of course, it's recorded. You can slow it down. You can pause it. You can go back. But we want to make sure that we kind of fit everything into it. And I think that's it. I think that's all you need for the session. And then, of course, registering for the session so you get the emails.
Yeah, that's awesome. That'll be the last thing I mention here. Before I ask my final question, which I may even answer myself, and marketing will help answer, shout out to Oscar, I'm seeing in the chat here, who passed his PL 300 Power BI data analyst certification. So well done, Oscar. Hopefully we were able to help you through that a little bit, but congrats to you on that. Big congrats. That's not an easy journey to go through, so nice job. All right, the final question here then is, how do you register for the event? So you were just talking about it. Our marketing team's going to put on the screen. Let me actually take the question off. The marketing team here has put on the screen how to register for the event. You can scan the QR code. You'll also find they'll put a link in the chat for you here momentarily if they haven't already. And follow the link, sign up to make sure you get notifications on when the event's happening. Any kind of follow-up after the event, we'll be sending out some follow-up information, of course, like we always do. So make sure you take a moment, register, just so we know that you're coming and that we can expect you. Other than that, we will see you there. Mitchell, I'll let you sign us off.
I was going to answer one question and then I'll sign us off. So Debbie said, are there any visual calcs or anything in visual calculations not in DAX? And the answer to that, Debbie, is yes. So make sure to sign into our event, and we'll make sure to cover it in that event. But there's definitely some new things that only work inside of visual calculations that we don't have outside of that. So that's very important. Other than that, I'm looking forward to the event. It's going to be awesome. This is a really cool, really exciting time for us DAX enthusiasts, and then maybe those people that are not excited about DAX. And so this session is going to cover a lot of what you can do with visual calculations, and we'll see you there.